Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Grow Summer Sessions here at Living Waters Church. My name is Luke. I'm on our pastoral team, and tonight is our fourth installment. What we are doing tonight is pretty simple. We come together to learn, and we are doing this live on YouTube. Maybe you're live and you're engaging with us right now, or maybe you're watching this at a later date. If you're watching at a later date, some of what I'm going to share isn't going to apply to you. But if you're watching live, it certainly will. What we basically do is come together to spend time growing together and learning together. There's a wealth of knowledge and expertise within our church and our community. And on these evenings, we're simply coming together to unearth some of that and enjoy it and learn together. This is our fourth installment of our Grow Summer series. And tonight is titled, I'm All Ears, Learning to Listen in a Noisy Age. And tonight we're really honored to be joined by Carolyn Kristjansen. And I've known Carolyn for quite some time, and she is a wealth of knowledge. She's got a wonderful perspective when it comes to listening for a few different reasons. Carolyn works at Trinity Western University, where she's the associate professor in applied linguistics. She's also set up a coaching program, which is very much about listening within the grad studies of the university. And so Carolyn's going to bring some perspectives. She's got a whole bunch of history behind her that don't speak particularly to those things that I've described, but some of those are probably going to come out in her talk. So Carolyn's going to talk for about 25, 30 minutes, and then she and I are going to have a conversation, and we are going to talk about listening, which is a little ironic, but we're going to do it anyway. And we're going to have a conversation about listening, learning to listen in a noisy age. The invitation for you, if you are joining us live, is actually to ask questions as we go. I'm going to be keeping track of some of those questions, and I'm going to do my best to ask them when we sit down and have a conversation at the end of Carolyn's talk. So if you have a question about any of the content that Carolyn is sharing, I'm going to keep track of those questions, and I'll bring them up when we have our conversation. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think that's all the housekeeping that we have to take care of. But thank you so much for joining us, Carolyn. Come on over and help us understand how to listen better.
Thanks, Luke. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you for inviting me to join you. This is a real treat. I get to talk about something that actually, my husband would be really happy to hear me talking about. I'm not sure if he's listening. But I would say the first few years of our marriage were probably the happiest of his life. We were living in Iceland at the time, and in an effort to try to learn Icelandic, I listened. I listened for 2 years. Those were the 2 best years of his life. But tonight, I'm not going to talk about that. Tonight, our topic is learning to listen in a noisy age. And there are basically 3 things that I'm going to talk about sandwiched in, along with some other things. But we're going to talk about listening in terms of place, invitation, and engagement. So 2 stories. I mentioned that when we were first married, we were living in Iceland. About a few years ago, I'm not going to tell you how long ago, we took a trip from Iceland to Canada. At that time, Linda Marie, our daughter, who goes by Linda, to those of you who know her here at Living Waters, was just 3 months old. And we arrived in the east coast of Canada. We were welcomed into the home of some kind relatives. I put her to bed in the bedroom that had been set aside for us, which happened to be right next to the living room, and then went out to visit. And then I noticed that she was starting to fuss a bit. Now, I wanted to finish something I was saying, so I said something, and I couldn't hear her. And then when I stopped talking, she would fuss again. And so I started to do a little experiment, and I noticed that as long as I was speaking, as long as she could hear my voice, she was content. When I was quiet, when she couldn't hear my voice, she started fussing. Well, of course, I went into the other room and I comforted her until she fell asleep. I thought that was so interesting. Now, she was tuning in She was tuning into my voice. She knew the voice. It brought her comfort. And so as long as she could hear it, the other sounds didn't matter. You know, that can work the opposite way as well. Tuning in can also mean that when we're tuning things out, we're tuning out stuff that maybe we should be listening to. Jokes and cartoons abound, depicting the relationship between husbands and wives and the impact on hearing. One that comes to mind is of a family expecting company. The wife is planning a special meal and also surveying what needs to be done to tidy things up. And she turns to her husband and says, I need you to go to the store, lay down the mulch, get the kids from swimming, pick up some flowers, and finish the rest of the dishes. The husband looks somewhat troubled. But then in the next frame, we see a smile starting to spread across his face. And the speech bubble above his head reads, ... go, ... lay, ... down, ... get, ... some rest. What went on? What was going on? Well, of course, that's just a joke. It is only a joke. But in both cases, this is a situation of selective perception. Perception is a complex physical and psychological sense-making process. It's the way that people connect to their environment. There's so much going on that we can't possibly make sense of everything all the time. And so selective perception refers to our human tendency to make sense of things going on in our environment based on our frame of reference. Paying attention to information that is congruent with our values and beliefs, while paying limited attention to or even filtering out information that is not. Well, what might that mean for our ability to listen in a noisy age? What catches my attention in the definition above is that our frame of reference is key to what we pay attention to and how we interpret it. Well, first of all, there's no question that we're in a noisy age. The current pandemic situation, along with the implications, the focus on issues of racism, politics, and so much more, economic implications, all of these things have only turned up the volume on important matters calling for our attention. Many people are speaking. Many people are shouting. Others are calling for more listening. One evening a couple of weeks ago, just within a very short period of time, as I moved from channel to channel, I heard 3 separate interviews where every person said, we need to listen. We need to listen. We need to listen. But who should we listen to? What should we listen to? How do we listen? When Luke set up this series, he emailed and asked us to pick a date. He emailed some topics, I imagine, to everybody. Everybody got a topic. And then we were asked to pick a date that would work for us. I don't think it's a coincidence that my talk tonight on listening follows 1, Ricky's talk on God's Word, including keeping the big picture in mind. 2, Kirsten's talk on prayer, including listening prayer. And last week, Luke Danduran's talk on turning neighbors into friends. Tonight, I'm going to propose that we explore listening in terms of practicing hospitality. What might it look like if we start there as our frame of reference? Remember, frame of reference is key in giving shape to where we direct our attention, to how we direct our attention, and to how we interpret what goes on. So we're going to explore that, thinking about listening and learning to listen from that perspective as an act, as a practice of hospitality. And we're going to talk about place, invitation, and engagement. So place. Miroslav Volf, who is a theologian, points out that Christians inescapably inhabit 2 worlds. They are in God and they are in the world. the world of biblical traditions, and the world of their own culture. Well, if we start with the bigger world there, and the biblical picture, how might that help us establish some parameters for hospitality, which can then help direct our attention to this question of learning to listen? Well, I'm reminded that in biblical times, God's people were called to hear before they were called to speak. They were called to listen as their starting point of reference. In Deuteronomy 6:4, what do we see? Hear, O Israel. Listen, O Israel. Scriptures call us to listen to the God who speaks. And what do we hear when we tune into his voice as found in Scripture? Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment in Mark 12:29-31, and he responded with the very same passage I just mentioned from the Old Testament. He said, the most important one is this: hear, O Israel, hear. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then he added another. The second is this, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Simply put, God calls his people to listen. We're then called to love God before anything, and then our neighbor. We're called to love our neighbor with the same level of commitment as to ourselves and our own agendas. Wow. Wow. Okay, but wait a second. Who is this neighbor? That's a question a lawyer asked Jesus in Luke chapter 10, verse 29-37. Definitions matter, you know, especially when you're looking to define boundaries. If you can define the parameters and you define what's in, you also know what's out. So it can be quite handy. Who is my neighbor? The lawyer asked. To which Jesus responds with the well-known story of the Good Samaritan, a story about how a man was beaten and robbed, left half dead, ignored by two religious leaders, and then cared for by a stranger, by a foreigner who was traveling through, who stopped his journey, who bound up the wounds of the injured man, took him to an inn to recover, picked up the tab for his long-term rehabilitation. Jesus tells a story and then asks a question and follows up. He says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man? And the lawyer said, well, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, go, do the same. But wait a minute. Did you notice that Jesus actually didn't answer the lawyer's question? The lawyer said, who's my neighbor? Or did Jesus answer the lawyer's question? Instead of giving a theoretical answer to the lawyer, who he should consider to be his neighbor, Jesus gave a practical lesson on how one actually becomes a neighbor to another person by the exercise of helpful love. Anyone who needs help and whom I have opportunity and power to help, no matter rank, race, religion, may be in my neighborhood. And guess what? That neighborhood goes with me. Wherever I go, wherever I am, if I am the neighbor, the neighborhood, the people that I'm called to love, they're around me. Well, it comes then as no surprise that being hospitable is one of the qualifications for leaders in the early Christian church, as well as the rank and file. No matter the circumstances, love of God and others and hospitality go together wherever people find themselves. Take Romans 12, for example. We see verse 9, let love be without hypocrisy. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Verse 10, verse 12, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation. Wait a minute, tribulation? That doesn't sound very good. Devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality, bless those who persecute you, bless and curse not. Wait a minute. There's hospitality sandwiched in between tribulation and persecution. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil. And so it goes. Hospitality. right in the middle of that interconnected set of practices that depict living out a relationship to God in relation to others and our social context. Remember, Wolf says that we inhabit two worlds. It's his way of saying that we're citizens of heaven and we're citizens of where we are. And we're called to live lives full of love and full of hospitality in that place. And there are many other verses that we could talk about. But loving God, loving others, and showing hospitality, they show up right smack where you are, at the center of the noisy messiness of real life. Whether the mood is happy or sad, whether people like you or not, even in the midst of persecution and tribulation. Wow. I don't know how you make sense of that, but it seems to me that hospitality is something that starts in the heart. It's about a manner of being in the world that is informed by the presence of God and His Word actively in our hearts and lives with real implications, regardless of the noise and the conditions. It means being in a place where we have to trust Him to fill us up. We can't do it on our own. It sounds crazy. Who can love this way? It means being in that constant dynamic relationship with Him. It means first and foremost tuning into Him, hearing His voice. It means that learning to listen in a noisy age starts at an internal place, in our heart, with disposition to hear what God says. It starts with the spiritual practice of listening, an inward posture that expands the parameter of our heart and flows outward to external places where we find ourselves. So, what does that mean for the external practice of listening as hospitality in a noisy age? Some of you are probably wondering if I would ever get there. Well, for now, I'd like to follow Jesus' model and answer my question with some other questions for you to just mull over. Question 1. If we view ourselves as brought into God's kingdom, bought with a price, created in God's image, called to faithful living in loving God and our neighbor, what implications might this have for the way we listen? If we consider our normal listening practices, how might they show hospitality? What might need to change? I think back to Dave's message last week about our preferred future, where we're going in the story. If we look at how we have listened in the past week, if somebody were tracking us and monitoring our patterns of listening, what would they imply about our view of God's kingdom and our future? Would they line up with that beautiful vision that we heard on Sunday? We'll just mull those things over. Invitation isn't just about place. Hospitality isn't just about place. It's about invitation. Invitation and creating space. So listening for hospitality, let's unpack that a little bit more. Who's to benefit from this anyway? Interestingly enough, I've heard quite a lot about hospitality on the news in recent weeks. The hospitality industry, that is. The hospitality industry is that broad group of businesses that provide services to customers in the basic areas of accommodations, food and beverages, and travel and tourism. We've all benefited from the services of the hospitality industry. But here's the deal. This is a transactional model of hospitality. It's a model where if you're a business owner, you're hoping to sell your services with some profit for yourself. If you're a customer, you're paying for a service. If you don't get what you want or you can't pay, then you're not likely to get the meal or accommodation or whatever it is that you hoped for. This is about a transactional, consumerist model of hospitality, and it has its place. My goodness, we've all benefited from it. But what I wonder And what has crossed my mind sometimes is, without us even thinking about it, does a transactional consumerist model of this type ever provide an implicit frame of reference for who we choose to listen to, who we welcome, for hospitality of listening? Who do we listen to? Who do we welcome? Those who think like us, like to talk about the kinds of things we like? People who don't cost too much in terms of the time and energy they require, who speak in styles and accents we can easily understand, who make us feel comfortable, admired, appreciated, possibly powerful, who, if we're seen with, will enhance our reputation, who have the kind of resources, connections, skills that will help us get to where we want to go. What about people who are different, are firmly committed to very different positions, and are very vocal about it, perhaps? People who we actually might consider to be quite difficult. Do we tend to steer clear of them? Avoid too much listening? If we do listen, do we do so just to notice gaps in their position that we can use as a point of departure to rebut their points, make a case for our position, show our superior knowledge or rhetorical skills? If we do listen, do we listen to really, truly understand their position from their perspective, regardless of how we feel about it, regardless of whether we agree with it? J.P. Moreland, philosopher, theologian, and Christian apologist at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, is someone who actually, I believe, studied under Dallas Willard, but he's participated in many public debates with thinkers on many issues. I remember listening to him quite a few years ago at an apologetics conference, and he said that his policy was to always start by learning the position of an opponent or someone who took a different point of view from the inside, trying to understand as they understood, and only then engaging in debate. That speaks of respect to me. Listening. Listening as an act of hospitality. Maybe not like the hospitality industry. How about listening as an act of hospitality in God's economy? Well, I said at the beginning that we came to Canada from Iceland. And while I was in Iceland, I had actually been teaching languages. I got a job at a school. We were pastoring a church that couldn't afford to pay us. And so we were both working full time, Indy and I. And my desire was to, God seemed to be opening this up for me. And my desire was to go back to school and to get a higher degree. And so I applied to a university, a local university here. And at first they didn't accept me. And this is a long story, but they didn't accept me because my undergraduate degree, which was a Bachelor of Theology, didn't quite fit the standard preparation, even though I qualified and more than qualified on their other types of prior learning assessments. But the door was opened and I was allowed to take 2 qualifying courses. And I was told that if I could take those 2 courses with first class standing, then I would be permitted to get into the master's program. So my very first class, I'm in the class and I'm loving it, and I've read stuff and I've thought about this. This is really exciting and energizing. And we're told we have to do a group project. And no problem. I've got ideas, and I go to the professor and I'm talking about it, and he's animated because I've been doing some reading and thinking and he knows all about it. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see somebody over that side of the room straightening up and listening. Well, that somebody happened to be the difficult person in the class. I hate to admit it, but that's what I thought. And that's what everybody thought. For whatever reason, this person No matter what was said, this person always had a different perspective. No matter what was suggested, this person had a different way of looking at it. Simply put, it was hard to please this person. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this person straightening up. Now, I know body language enough to know what that meant. And I saw this person moving near. And to my deep shame, probably the only time in my life I remember doing it, I turned to block this person. I shut the person out. I continued talking to the professor. I thanked the professor, and I made a beeline for the door without looking back. Just before I got to the door, I heard this person ask a question to the only other person left in the room, who happened to be in my group. He said, "Can I join your group?" And she said, "Yes." Just like that. As I'm speaking to you now, I can tell you it sounded like God was speaking in my ear. He said, "That should have been you. You take care of my business, and I'll take care of yours." But the stakes were high. I couldn't afford to lose a grade, any kind of a grade. I couldn't afford it, I thought. It was going to cost me too much. My whole future, as I understood it, kind of hinged on that course. You take care of my business. I'll take care of yours. You look out for the things that I call you to look out for, and I will make a way for you. I will take care of your affairs. Well, guess what? There was traffic all the way home. And that was a university that was really far from where I lived. I had 2.5 hours to repent and ask the Lord to give me another chance. And he did. And the next day, I embraced this person with as much grace and love and hospitality as I could muster, asking God to give me more. And guess what? The person was as difficult as ever. Harder. It was the hardest group I've ever worked in. And I thought, well, Lord, at least I know I'm honoring you. I'm going to do this your way. Well, to make a long story short, the person decided to leave the group and finish the project on their own. But God taught me a lesson. And that became a guiding light for me when it came to hospitality, when it came to God's business. You take care of my businesses, God. I'll manage your affairs. So my question is, if this is God's business, is it something I should be engaging in? Well, there's a lot more that could be said, but I'm going to keep moving. The one thing that I would just like to say is God, according to Dallas Willard, every last one of us has a small kingdom or an area of influence, a realm that is uniquely ours, where we have some choice in determining what happens. And God, he's not calling us to be the savior of the world. He has given Jesus to be the savior of the world, but he puts us in a place, in a sphere of influence where we can make a difference, no matter how big or how small. And if we are faithful to him and we learn to discover that working with him and in these day-to-day moments, we can count on him, that he will fill us and he will animate those interactions, and he will bring us presence and he will bring us power into those relationships, and he will give us what we don't have to do what he's calling us to do. Well, contrast the consumerist approach, the my business approach to hospitality with the generosity of true hospitality and engagement on the part of hosts. My last area to talk about is engagement. What does kingdom-style living really look like? Kingdom-style listening hospitality. We moved back to Canada permanently from Iceland about just a little over 2.5 decades ago. It was pretty interesting. I was the only Canadian in the group, and I didn't feel Canadian. My husband was Icelandic. My kids had been born in Iceland, and I had lived most of my adult life overseas. But we had amazing neighbors, Jim and Blanche Van Tall. They knew how to welcome the stranger. They showed us incredible hospitality, being fully present to us, listening to our stories and to our hearts. They probably heard more stories of Iceland than they could ever count. And they no doubt heard some things that were very perplexing and possibly even offensive to their Dutch Canadian ears. But when the words were wrong, they gave us the benefit of the doubt. I remember one day when Blanche was visiting us, and suddenly she's talking to my daughter, and she said, Mr. Jim is in the garage, but you can come and see Mr. Jim and Mrs. Blanche later. You know what I realized? I'm Canadian, right? I was raised to be polite and respectful, but we had been immersed in Icelandic culture. Culture, well, everybody calls everyone by their first names, regardless of their age or status. And here, my two kids had been calling my neighbors, who should have been Mr. and Mrs. Van Tall to them, or at very least, with permission and great generosity, Auntie Blanche and Uncle Jim, and they'd just been calling them Jim, Blanche. Well, it might not seem like a big deal, but I was mortified. And really, Blanche could have called me out on it. But just graciously, ever so kindly, she inserted that little gentle reminder into the conversation. She thought the best. She understood the intent was not to be offensive. So, much more could be said, but simply put, we were seen, heard, and understood. As recipients of that kind of hospitality, we too reached out. But, sometimes we didn't always listen as well as we could. And I remember one night having a missionary couple over, wanting so to encourage them and telling them my stories of how God had answered prayer and met needs. And when it was time to go, the gentleman looked at me and said, well, thank you. Maybe next time we can tell you our stories. And I realized I had been hoping to encourage him, but I hadn't listened. I'd been hoping to encourage them, but I really hadn't understood where they were coming from. I hadn't taken the time. They had been seen, we had seen them, but not heard or understood. So, what does it mean to entertain strangers? To engage strangers or friends and their stories? Shirley Pohl defines strangers as people without a place, without networks of relations that sustain or support human beings. Offering hospitality to strangers involves making room for those with no place. For those in the role of host, it means sharing themselves and their lives, not just their skills. It also means listening. Listening hospitality requires not only treating guests with kindness, but inviting them and their insights into the conversation. It means assuming they have stories to tell and making space for those stories as part of the process of knowing. Making space for their stories means seeing people as human beings rather than embodied needs or interruptions. Far more than a tame and pleasant practice, listening hospitality in this sense can have a strong countercultural dimension and function as an act of resistance to the norm. Pohl goes on to point out that especially when the larger society disregards or dishonors certain persons, small acts of respect and welcome are potent far beyond themselves. They point to a different system of valuing and an alternate model of relationships. Hey, that sounds like kingdom culture. That sounds like kingdom-style hospitality. So, what would it mean to cultivate the practice of listening hospitality, kingdom style? What kind of formative practices would support that? According to author David Smith, foremost are attentiveness and a willingness to learn, especially with those whose own frames of reference differ from ours. One of the challenges in encountering people from language backgrounds and cultures other than our own is our common human tendency to use our own instinctive frames of reference to orient ourselves and judge our surroundings. Smith goes on and says that this is part of what sustains stereotyping and cultural misunderstandings. Love of neighbor is a reorienting to God's frame of reference, and it demands, among other things, learning to slow down, and be genuinely attentive instead of leaping to quick judgments based on superficial impressions. Many times, regardless of background or limited shared reference, we need patience. We need patience to find riches in the words and the lives of others. Question. If we view ourselves as created in God's image, bought with a price, brought into his kingdom, to live faithfully at his call, at his bidding, to expand his kingdom by drawing people into that community, into relationship with him. How does that frame of reference influence the way we pay attention to those around us? The way we respond to their stories? We've been talking about learning hospitality as a way to frame our understanding of how we might learn to listen in a noisy age. Perhaps you're thinking, are you kidding me, woman? I can't do this. I'm barely coping myself. I want you to know that our loving, gracious Father sees you, hears you, and understands. He longs to be fully present, to encourage you, to support you, to draw you to a place where instead of saying, I can't do this, you say, I can't do this yet, but I'm going to, God's help. He's always and fully present to hear us and meet us exactly where we're at. Final story. Another crying baby story. I know, I'm a mother, what can I say? In January, I was returning from a trip, and I walked into an airport restroom and I saw Mother changing her baby. And she was talking to the baby gently, quietly, and the baby started to cry. The baby didn't like what Mom was doing and started to cry louder and louder and louder, and the sobbing continued until the baby could hardly breathe, and Mom was talking gently and softly. And suddenly the baby can't cry anymore and took a breath and caught just a little whiff of Mom's voice. And it happened again. And gradually the sobbing subsided and he could hear his Mom's voice. And it reminded me of how that is so much like us sometimes with our Father. We're so taken up by the noise around us, and we start to cry and call out, God, where are you? I can't hear you. Help, help, help. All the while, he's there, speaking to us, caring for us, holding us tight. It might be a noisy age, but he's speaking. And as we turn first to him as our frame of reference, he will teach us to listen and offer hospitality, kingdom style. My invitation for you tonight is that if you feel you'd like to take this opportunity, that you find a place just to ask the Father if there's anything about what we've talked about that he would like you to respond to. And if there is, ask him what it might be. Remember, he's called us to listen. That means he speaks. And he wants to speak to you. God bless.
Thanks so much, Carolyn.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed listening to you.
Oh, thank you.
Taken a bunch of notes and have some questions for you. I'm just going to move this out of the way.
Absolutely.
So that, we have no impediments between us.
No problem.
And we've got some people watching live and learning. And I've got our window open here, so we might have some questions coming in, but I've got a whole bunch anyway.
Okay, sounds good.
I was saying to Carolyn before we started tonight that I've been looking forward to this conversation kind of all week, not just because it's with a physical person. We don't.
How novel is that? I know.
We don't get a lot of it, but just because I'm just so interested in your background, and we've spent time in life groups together and things like that.
That's right.
But this is a conversation that I'm really interested in as I'm trying to grow and learn as as a listener.
Mhm.
And so I loved your approach of listening as a act of hospitality. And it's interesting because when you started talking, I was like, I think she's preaching the sermon that I'm actually writing right now. I've actually completed it for next week. It's ready to go. And I was like, oh man, she's getting into like, we might just say the same thing, which is awesome. But when you talk about listening as an act of hospitality, and you've experienced people from various cultures in your job and in your travels and in your life. You have parents who are global workers, and so you've interacted with a lot of different cultures. When you think about that, how have you seen listening as an act of hospitality turn up in different cultures that you've participated in, or people from different cultures that you've had conversations with? Do you have any insights to that, of how you see that represented?
Oh, yes, I would say with great generosity to start.
Okay.
One of the ways it shows up often is, of course, with food.
Okay.
And sharing food or
Right.
sharing drink. One of the some very impactful acts of hospitality that come to mind is from when I was a child in Brazil. And I remember at one point visiting a woman in the part of the country, there was a severe drought there at the time. And from my memory, there was very little furniture in the house, and all she had to offer us was curdled milk. And I think there was sugar to go with it. And it wasn't something that really I wanted to eat, to be truthful.
Right. Yeah.
But it was offered with such care that I did. And I remember other stories like that where people who had, it didn't have a lot, very joyfully shared what they had. In Iceland, hospitality was always come to our house, and lots of food, and sharing, of course, stories goes with it.
Yeah.
But those are the things that stand out to me: food and stories and conversation.
So, and you feel that sets the table for us to be able to listen to one another, like, because when we talk about listening from certain perspectives, we're like, yeah, I know what it means by I'm just going to listen for the information that I'm trying to seek, or maybe I'm trying to empathize to some degree, to like seek to understand as you mentioned. But it seems that there's when we use that word hospitality and connect it to listening, it just broadens the whole experience of how we relate to each other.
It does, and I think that's the key. So what we've been trying to do tonight is talk about a disposition.
Right.
And so listening as a disposition of generosity, listening as a disposition of a spacious, open heart, listening to the good intentions, not looking for what we don't agree with in ways to refute it, but listening to the person. And of course, that can occur anywhere. It can occur in an airplane seat. I've seen my dad have all kinds of incredible, when I was a little girl, conversations, my parents. But listening doesn't usually occur in a vacuum.
Right.
It occurs in some other context. And one of the things I didn't say tonight is that when God calls us to engage in the world, it's usually in places where we already have some connection.
Right.
And it's just a question of, are we listening? It's so easy not to listen, not to give voice to people. Just somehow they become invisible to us for whatever reason, maybe not intentionally. So generally speaking, hospitality of listening occurs in a context where there is already some connection, I would say, but not necessarily exclusively.
Yeah, because it can just pop up out of nowhere.
Absolutely.
But I wonder if that's part of the challenge that we're facing in parts of our society right now. Whereas there's this lack of time-taking, lack of hospitality in some aspects of our culture. There's a hurry that we're caught up in. And so when we say, man, well, no one's listening to each other, well, that's not just an isolated issue. That's found within the broader context of us not actually spending time and taking time and valuing one another enough to invest in creating spaces where we can even listen to one another. I don't know how that sits with you.
Absolutely. And it's so hard. It's so hard. I think of that a lot. And just even though you believe in taking time and slowing down,
Yeah.
it can be hard to find ways to actually make that happen, just given the commitments and the way that life, our jobs require certain things of us at this stage of the pandemic. All the time that we spend online things can take exponentially longer, it seems. And so it's not an easy thing to do. But here's my philosophy. It's a question of, what's one little thing I can do? What's one little thing that'll move me in the direction of that? And so, yes, it's hard, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And being connected to people when we can make these kinds of connections is great too. You know?
Absolutely. And picking up on that one little thing we can do. I mean, you brought up the pandemic, and I think that as much as that's pulled us onto online and maybe felt like it's a disconnection, one of the things I've seen through social media is also people, because of the limitations that it's brought, finding themselves living in simpler ways. I can't go to the, well, I can now, but they couldn't go to the mall. They couldn't go to the restaurant. So all I'm doing is spending time with people in my immediate proximity, family or whatnot. And I'm going outside, or now I'm trying gardening, or I'm just going on walks. And all of a sudden, the world opens up a little bit more, even though it feels like it's closed down. Like the smaller things get, the more open they get. And so I feel like, there is it can feel like, we're swimming really upstream against what feels like a hurried, rushed, fast-paced microwave society. And yet there's little things that we can do that really crack things wide open for us. Like, to follow that further, what, and this was a question I had. It came a little bit later, but I want to ask it now. You talked about the neighborhood going with you wherever you go. And I think that for me was such a vivid picture, because just hearing the parable and understanding that, and if you've been in the church for 4 minutes, you've heard that parable 1,000 times. But that phrase of the neighborhood going with us wherever we go, and that you acknowledge that can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes, like, oh, that's a lot of pressure. But I would just ask you, like, personally, as you talk about little things you can do, what kinds of practices have you embraced personally to be a present listener wherever you go in the neighborhoods that you're surrounded by, that you carry with you?
It's going to sound funny, but I actually carry on running conversations with Jesus in my head, which doesn't sound like you're present, but it's like, Lord, help me to hear, to see this person with your eyes, and help me to hear what they're saying, not just the words they're using, but what is being said. And then I suppose to some extent the coach training comes in, and you never coach somebody without their permission, but you can listen in that way. And listen to what they say. What are the values that are there? What don't they say? Or where's the mismatch between what they say and maybe what their body language is saying? And just noticing those things. And sometimes one of the things I didn't say tonight is, I think God allows us to see things. He'll show us things. And it's not necessarily even to talk to them about, but it's to take to Him. So that we're coming out of that situation and we have been present, and He's shown us something to pray for them. And then later, perhaps, there will be an opportunity to engage them with it. But I think there's an awful lot that God would have us see in other people, not because we're reading their mail, but because He wants us to pray for them and to meet their needs in that way.
Just to be even perceptive to that.
To be in that
and then
place.
To say, what do I do with what I'm perceiving? Exactly.
So I constantly draw on those kinds of techniques, just as I think it's a matter of habit. I don't think I'm always aware of it, but just kind of, and asking the Lord for insight. So God, how do I make sense of this? What are you doing in this situation? How do you want me to understand this?
So there's like a tuning in to God, and that doesn't feel like, oh, I'm in two frequencies. It actually helps you align, and like it's like you have a listening partner. Like there's two of you doing that together versus it just being on you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. It's true. And then sometimes this thought will pop into my head, which might seem a strange thing to ask, but then it turns out that maybe that's something really important, and then I listen some more, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't always happen that way. But yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think I've learned through my coaching certification and training, and you're much further along in the journey of that. But as I've endeavored and grown this year, learning in those moments in a conversation with someone where coaches are trained to, listen for 80% of the time, maybe offer 20% of what we would voice, and just hearing something and going, okay, that's a bit of a hunch I have right now, and maybe what they're saying or what I'm thinking is important to share later, and just suspending that to the end of the conversation, and then sharing it, and then occasionally someone being coached will go, I was thinking about that the whole time as well, and it's like, well, there's this interplay that we're actually all tuned in, whatever our beliefs about God. There's some degree, we're all kind of in some sort of strange frequency together when we create a space to actually understand each other, and that solution building happens uniquely. So that's one of the things you offered, is like you kind of tune into God. What other like tangible practices would you say that you work at to be a practicer of a listening away, a hospitable listener? What kind of other things would you do?
I like to sit close, not so close that people are uncomfortable, but I like to really be in close proximity where I can see. I find that, for example, that the online world a bit challenging.
Yeah.
Because you can only see sometimes neck up, which is hard. I mentioned the idea of prayer as a place of preparation, for just kind of tuning in to what might be on people's hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And then I find that even people that I'm not sure how I'm going to interact with, but if I pray about it first, sometimes God will just drop things in my heart about things to be alert to. And so that is a conscious practice. And I think just listening, like I say, not just to the words, but trying to discern what is there. Another area, a way of listening, is thinking at it from a Christian perspective, is that many times things that are on our hearts and minds, we're seeking to fill certain desires. But at the deepest level, God desires to fill our heart's greatest longings. And so listening for that level. So one of the practices just in coaching with people getting at values in there is, so people say, well, this is what I'd love to have this. And you ask, well, what would that give you? And they'll say whatever it is. And so, well, what would that give you? And as you ask those things, you get down to kind of something that's really kind of at the level. And so often I'm listening and thinking, well, this is something that seems to be important to them, but what's really the underlying desire that God would like to fill? And so listening kind of on that frequency too, sometimes thinking about that.
Yeah. That reminds me a lot of actually of how actors talk about their process.
Interesting.
Because an actor will often work through their script, and the question they ask themselves in the process as they try and embody a character is, what do I want? What does this character want? And they aim at motivation, not at what the words say. And they're getting in behind that, because what you can be saying and what you're conveying and what you really want or need might be different things, or they might be a little bit hard to discern, as you said. So it just reminded me of that practice, that even an actor, as they try and understand motivation and get inside another person's skin, so to speak, it's getting at want and desire. And so when we're interacting with someone, how do we understand what they want and really listen for that? I love that preparation of prayer too, because even if we don't carry into a situation maybe what we maybe God's not dropped anything into our heart, right? Some people might say, well, God's never told me anything to be able to be aware of when I go to a conversation. But at the very least, our hearts are soft. At the very least, we're like opening ourselves up to love and to God. And then hopefully we're at least arriving in a place of openness and vulnerability and concern, at the very least.
And I think sometimes we make it way too mystical.
Okay.
In
Yeah.
terms of God, it's not like you always hear. So, I do. Like that story I told, I can tell you, it was like God spoke to me. It's like he was standing next to me, speaking audibly. It was so powerful. Yeah. But often it's just, I ask God for something, and I suddenly get this idea.
Right.
This impression.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's it. Right.
Well, but it's exactly in response to what I've asked. And so I think that God says he speaks.
Yeah.
And we're told that his sheep hear his voice.
Right.
So you don't have to journal for an hour to hear God speak and have the music on and the lights down low.
Fast for 40 days first.
Yeah. I'm not trying to in any way cheapen it. Yeah. I just genuinely believe that he longs to speak to us.
Yeah.
We're in this dynamic relationship.
Yeah.
And that he is a part of Jesus walked around in his day and age in the midst of what everybody else was doing.
Yeah.
And so that's what we are, and he's with us. And
God speaks to us through one another.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think we're a little bit afraid of that sometimes. We're like, but really reading the scripture, understanding what are prophets, what are not, like human interaction, and that's how it works. And sometimes we're not even aware of how God's speaking through us.
That's right.
To one another. And I don't know how many times I've had a conversation ahead of something coming up in a week, and I feel like I'm being faced with this person in this conversation, and it's about this moment, but it's also about what I'm going to be facing in a few more days. Sometimes that's like preaching or something like that.
Yeah.
And you're like, this feels like God's saying something to me right now. Am I listening?
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of a lovely resource for listening. It comes out of the Mark Center.
Okay.
By Steve and Eve Clausen, I think, in Abbotsford. And it's just a lovely tool on listening and different ways of listening. And if anybody's interested in that, one of the ways of God speaking to us is through other people. Yeah. And now there might be circumstances. I often find that God drops insights into my heart. Just little things happen. It's like all of a sudden I get this insight as to how it might represent something in my relationship with him or some other insight. And so listening in different ways at different levels by just not being afraid, I guess.
Yeah, not being afraid, which happens to be a lot of in the Bible. Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions here that are coming through. So one person asks, what are some ways to help others get to the place where they feel comfortable to open up so that you can listen? I guess what it's asking is, as a person who wants someone to feel comfortable, like what can we do to help someone feel safe, maybe?
I was just going to say, safety.
Okay.
Safety is the first place, and that's going to mean different things for different people.
Right.
But as we spend time, sometimes it's kind of hard to sit down and just have a conversation with somebody you don't know. Yeah. I've often found that doing things together is a great way to kind of create that shared experience, something to talk about. You're not talking about stuff, you're talking about doing something, tangible stuff. Now it's a little bit harder these days given the situation and the limits, but doing something, going for a walk, doing something together, sharing a cooking class or whatever it is, but just finding something that the other person enjoys. Letting them pick and doing stuff together. And when you're doing stuff, you gain that traction. Trust is something that is a gift. It's something you earn. Yeah. You can't just take it. And it's sometimes for some people it's a very it's something that's very precious, and so it's only given to you after a lot of time and investment. Yeah. And it is valuing them enough to invest in that relationship. If God has put them in your lives, then that is definitely it's worth it. It's worth it. But that would be one thing that I've always found very helpful.
Yeah, creating safety, and that within the context of hospitality makes so much sense. What are we doing when we think of hospitality, especially if we thought about it in the context of a home, let's say? Yeah. But creating places to come into these walls where it is safe and where we can be together. Mm-hmm. And it feels like when we talk about someone opening up and listening, there's the odd person you meet on the street that you just ask them one question. But that's an indication, right, how desperate people are to be listened to as well. Mm-hmm. For me, that, as you were talking, that progression is really, how do I create a safe moment here? Mm-hmm. how does that inform the trust that's earned between
Mm-hmm.
us?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe there's a place where they will feel safe enough to be vulnerable and for me to then listen to them.
Right.
And that, like you said, that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been in lots of situations where it doesn't take that much time because people don't find themselves often in safe places. And sometimes you find yourself having a conversation with people going, do they have anywhere safe to be? Do they have anyone that they trust? Because what they're pouring out to me,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not because they know I'm a minister or something. It's just because I'm here.
Yeah.
Has that been your experience?
Yes, absolutely. There are times when people don't have anybody close to them that they feel they can share their stuff with.
Yeah.
And so it's actually safer
Yeah.
to talk to somebody that they don't really know and maybe might not see again or certainly not too soon. And I think, I mean, that's where this whole idea of presence, in coaching, the idea of just being fully present for people, as you mentioned. But you do that with your body language, you do that with your genuine interest in them. I'm not sure how to describe it, but we know when it's not there too.
Yeah, you can smell it.
Oh my goodness. How many times have you been in a conversation and occasionally it happens, doesn't happen a lot, but you're in a conversation and you know that the person you're talking to, they have their head somewhere else.
Yeah.
And you make a comment and they say something that's not even connected. It's like, you did not hear a word I said.
Yeah. We've probably all done that today at some point, right, to one another.
Yeah, well, we do that.
Yeah.
And it's not because we're trying, but sometimes it just happens. But being present as much as we can, and being real.
Yeah.
Being real. Mm-hmm. Hey, I didn't get what you said. Can you repeat that or whatever, right?
Well, that's one of the things that we learn in coaching, right? Is that sense of, you know what? If you don't know what they're saying, if you don't understand, why don't you just ask? Because if you're confused, and they might be confused, so we need to get unconfused together.
That's right.
Get clarity together.
Lead me out of the woods here.
Yeah, exactly. Just being present with people reminds me of a story, and I'm pretty sure it's accurate. I'm 90% sure it's accurate. But I've heard of tales of Eugene Peterson when he was at Regent College. And for those who don't know, Eugene Peterson he's a Christian writer, pretty influential Christian writer, but that he would actually budget more time to get from his office to different places so that he wouldn't feel rushed when he went from place to place, knowing that he would inevitably be stopped by somebody. And he wanted to be able to fully be present with them and not go, but I've got to get to this. And I just found that so fascinating that it's like that's how he spent his time was to build in margin for the person he may not even know that he's going to run into. Yeah. And that struck me as pretty profound and radical. But then I thought, why is that so radical that we would actually care about each other that much?
That's right.
Is it weird that I think it's radical?
No, it's what a beautiful illustration of creating space in your life for others, anticipating that opportunity. That's lovely. I can't claim to know that. I'm sorry.
I don't think I'm there either, but it's inspiring.
It is. It's something to aim for.
Yeah, it is. So another couple of questions here, Carolyn, if that's okay.
Sure.
I think we've got some time. So Ruben, what are we looking like for time? About 10 minutes or so. So
okay.
let's enjoy it. One of the questions I had was just for you personally. You talked about when we viewed people, sometimes we view them as just embodied needs. Mm-hmm. And I think you also said, or as interruptions. Mm-hmm. Like this is just someone who's just full of needs and they're taking from me, or they're just interrupting my life and I'm not even aware of their needs. Mm-hmm. For you personally, how do you feel listened to? Like, what does it look like for someone to create safety and trust for you in your experience? What do you personally need? Because we can talk abstract, but what does that mean for you? You've been coached, you've probably had all kinds of conversations with different people, but what does that look like for you so that you don't feel like an embodied need? You don't feel like an interruption. How do we do that?
That's a great question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that in that way. I think what really does it for me is that if I'm talking about something, I feel like they are able to tell it. They can repeat it back, or they can respond in a way that shows they've heard. Now, I know for myself that sometimes I'm in a situation where just because of the setting, I'm a bit distracted.
Right.
And sometimes I don't fully grasp what someone has said because of that setting. So I recognize that people don't always respond that way, not because they're not being present or they're not being attentive or they're not trying to make me feel safe, but just because of the circumstances. But that's a big thing. I think there's just something about warmth. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but there's just something that you can sense in people when they there's a delight being with you.
Right.
They actually just seem to enjoy it.
Right. Yeah.
There's something about the look on a face or the body language or just the kinds of interaction. I also find that I feel I think it's when people get to know me and they take note of the things that matter to me, and they'll go to their way to do it.
Right.
And so I feel that says a lot. Says a lot.
How would someone do that for you? Like, what would that look like practically?
Well, practically, you would never know it looking at my desk right now, but I like order to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah.
My desk is ordered chaos. It has piles of stuff and I know where the pile. But something like that where, let's say if somebody were using my space and when they left, they left it the way they had found it, for example.
Right.
That speaks to me of thoughtfulness.
Right.
And that says, I value you. Now, other people don't do it, not because they don't care. Yeah. But it's just not on their radar. The external environment doesn't mean a whole lot to them. To me, I happen to like the external environment is something that I read. I also love God's creation. I don't do a lot of hiking or outdoors kind of stuff. I kind of chained to my desk. There's an invisible chain there that keeps me there many hours a day. But I love flowers. I absolutely love, and I regularly have flowers on the table upstairs. Right now I bought a planter and I stuck it right outside. I have my office is just slightly below ground level, and so the window opens up onto a sidewalk, and I have a big planter right there, and I am constantly inspired by God's incredible creativity, the colors, the textures, whatever. So when people do things like that, or a cup of coffee. I love good coffee. So I think it's just knowing the things that I value and caring enough to find out and doing little things. It's not big stuff.
Yeah.
It's the little stuff.
It's being curious about somebody and then just empathizing and seeking to understand what they're curious about and interested in. Yeah. One thing that we've been doing, this is weird to say this as the camera's over here, but one thing we've been doing as we've been talking is we've been talking with eye contact. That's something that I feel doesn't happen an awful lot in our culture, is talking with eye contact. And maybe the more that you talk with people and you intentionally do that, it happens. But my experience of the world is that I don't know if there's a fear about it, a fear of vulnerability or a fear of connection. But what's been your experience when it comes to active listening to people and how important something like eye contact is? Because that's another small step that we could go, well, maybe that's something I don't do, but I want to get better at that kind of thing.
Yes, it depends a lot on the cultural context.
Well, there's an assumption from my part.
So in our cultural context, it's absolutely a way to connect. But in some cultural contexts, you lower your gaze to show respect.
An act of respect.
Yes, and I remember the first time I encountered that. I was a young teacher and I was working with a student, and the student always looked like this, and so I would bend down, and the student kept and had a ball cap on and just kept lowering that cap, and there was no way I could make eye contact.
Lying on the floor by the end of the...
Pretty much, and this poor student that I knew, of course, finally it kind of dawned on me, hey, there's a reason for this.
Right.
That was a long time ago. And so, yes, but in culturally appropriate ways, eye contact is a great place. And you see, I think people who are... I think it is a way to develop trust. Yeah. Because in many ways, people say the eyes are the window to the soul. Yeah. And if people feel comfortable although sometimes when you talk about it, they might not, you know,
Fair
then it is something we can practice. I remember practicing that in coach training. I don't know if you did that.
I don't remember that, but I've worked on that beforehand, so I don't know. But yeah, maybe I need to brush up on that a little bit more.
I had never done it before then, but to me, I guess I'm drawn to people's eyes.
Right. Yeah.
I'm drawn to because there's just so much that you can. It kind of shines through.
Yeah, you can see a lot.
Yeah.
But regardless of eye contact, even culturally, I don't think we're ever going wrong if we're just giving somebody our full attention.
No.
And I think that's something that Sarah and I have experienced in hosting like life groups and small groups of people in our home when we could do that. Especially we did, newcomers groups where new people to the church would come and we would come together for kind of 5 weeks and everybody would hear the story. And one of the things that I felt really clearly is that each week, someone would share their story. Well, you just met a whole bunch of people that you don't know. You're together for 5 weeks and you're just going to tell your life story. Some people are comfortable with that, but many people find that to be very strange and quite vulnerable. And they turn up to a house they don't know and people they don't know. And I realized that we had to set the tone in the first couple of weeks really strongly of going, if someone is talking at any point in the evening, I have to give them 100% of my attention. And it's signaled to the rest of the group that what we do here is listen. And even if someone starts like going, hey, I'm like, I'm actually not going to ignore, but it's like, no, this person's talking, especially when people were sharing their stories. Because there'd be the odd personality that would jump in or make a joke or whatever. But pretty quickly, everybody got the message. When someone's talking, we do not interrupt them. They have the talking stick. So we kind of had an invisible talking stick that we didn't speak about. So whatever we do, there's this sense of giving someone our full attention. And that, in a distracted age, can be challenging.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing with that is those little things that we do, if we do them regularly, they become sort of like an invisible part of our practices. It's just who we are.
Yeah.
But they communicate such respect.
Yeah.
They communicate care. And and when a community starts to adopt those practices, it has that ripple effect.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like teaching. I think about this kind of stuff in relation to teaching. So what do the practices in my classroom look like? Well, right now I'm doing online teaching, so it's a little bit harder, but how do the practices, my position vis-a-vis students or students' positions vis-a-vis others? Well, and how do we set it up so if people are feeling vulnerable, they don't have to be looking at somebody and, they don't have, if you're sitting, sometimes it feels safer to just be walking side by side or sitting side by side. But starting with where people are at and then building that level of comfort and that kind of attention that you've talked about is a really important message.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it just taught me that this can spread quicker and it's not as difficult as it appears. It just starts with kind of that discipline. And I think Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, talks about it. Described like the discipline of listening and cultivating the discipline so that it becomes muscle memory to some degree.
Absolutely. And that includes, like just kind of ignoring some of the distractions that are so prevalent. Your phone, your text messages, conditioned to check the ping, conditioned to, but what a gift. If that ping comes in, you're still talking and you just let it wait. It takes a lot of discipline for some people. Somebody was saying the other day that that people who have spent a lot of time on the phone, there's been some research done, and I don't know what it is, so I cannot dig it up, but the source was credible. But the study was that this person these folks had 10% less cognitive capacity available to them because they were constantly monitoring the phone. So 10% of their presence was on, And I wonder how often we allowed ourselves to get distracted by the things that they're happening, but they're not the really important thing. And that comes back to Stephen Covey, the old, bestseller, 7 Habits of a Highly Successful Person or whatever. But excuse me, like the Matrix, the things that are really important versus the things that are urgent and important, or excuse me, urgent but not important.
Yeah.
not important and not urgent.
Yeah.
And so often the really important things, we can let them wait.
Yeah.
Without dealing with them, and they will wait, and we might not get to them, and we'll be jumping and dealing with the urgent and important, and the urgent and not important, like our phones and like so many things, and letting the really important stuff just kind of slide by. But it's those the things that are really important that are the things that give that depth.
Yeah.
And richness to our lives. And so these kinds of practices of being intentional,
yeah,
and thinking about how we do these kinds of things can really give us, I think, that extra sense of awareness, maybe, or at first, and then it just becomes a part of the way we do life.
Yeah. Then all of a sudden, maybe we're not as distracted as we used to be, and
Mm-hmm.
we're at least practicing some more of that. Carolyn, thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, really. We know you take time out of your busy schedule, and for all the insight that you brought tonight and then the conversation following, we really, really appreciate it. So thanks for being a part of this. And great to see you in the flesh.
Likewise. My goodness.
This is really, really nice. But thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
And our next time that we're gathering for this is going to be another 2 weeks' time. And the topic that we're in is gone off the top of my head. I think we're talking about faith on the margins and talking about what it means
Richard Belton.
with Richard Belton.
Oh, that'll be good.
We're looking forward to that. So thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you
Bye.
soon.